let's stick it to the man and put a spin on this system. The most fundamental system to painting miniatures is a 3-step process, starting with basing the model, then shading it, then highlighting it. Miniature paint lines have become designed around these principles, especially ones just meant for trying to get your army done. Triad systems, special washes, dip methods, oil washes, everything's an effort to get you to put paint to plastic and get yourself a finished army.
I currently have some mummified undead horse bowmen to finish. But if that's not enough, these undead beast riders also came out this November from one-page rules. I love beast models of all sorts, even undead, so at least one of these isn't getting by without a splash of paint either, which gives me about 1 3/2 of models to finish, and only one weekend to do them.
Which is where the strength of the 3-step system comes in. It's quick. So to start, I want to show how the 3-step system works in its simple form, which contentiously is actually 4 steps.
Step 1, base coat. This is exactly how it sounds, where we want to get the base color we're using for each part painted solidly onto that part. This is where you start to pick your colors for your color scheme as well. So for natural leather parts, I'm just going to use a mid-range brown. For the saddle and some of the armor, I want gold, so metallics fit into this mold just fine too. For the wrappings, some nice light yellowish brown for a weathered bandage look. And lastly, the cloth, which I'll make red, but start my red by actually mixing a bit of white into it to make it pink. This sets us up for the second half of base coating, which is to give each layer a second thin coat. Even if it already looks pretty solid, since most of this will be seen in the final product, we want to make sure this is where we're spending our time making it look even with a solid fill. Each color just gets painted over top again with the same colors used before, except in the case of red. It's a bit of an advanced thing, but red and yellow will always look better if you start with a color brighter than them. So that's why I added the white in the first layer, so it covered better, and now this second red layer should also finish with a more even coverage and be nice and bright. Step 2, shade. The simplest form of shading is usually a wash. Simpler still if you just use the same color wash to shade everything at the same time. In the case of our rider here, all the colors I've chosen will actually work well with a brown wash, which you can make with a paint and mediums. But because we're going the easy route, many paint lines come with pre-made washes, most of them designed just for this purpose. Using a large brush, transfer the wash onto the model, spreading it out until it pools around all the depths and edges. Just remember that gravity is a thing, so as it dries it will pool on the lower parts more than the higher ones. So by spreading it out and keeping the layer mostly even, you won't get too many large dark spots. Step X, rebase. When the wash dries, you'll see that it's filled in all the recesses and made them much darker. But even outside of that, it has darkened up the original colors. So this secret step in the 3-step system is to clean up the wash a bit by using the base colors again to bring them back to their original strength. Stay away from the valleys where the wash settled, and keep the paint thin with just a bit of water as well, not overloading the brush with the paint. Once it dries, we'll have our natural colors back, but fade off into those darker recesses. Step 3, highlight. To make the highlighting easy and quick, I'm going to do some parallel highlighting. I'll be using a little smaller brush for this and lighter forms of the base layers by either adding a tiny bit of white or using a lighter shade in your paint range. Load the brush up and roll it on the palette to make sure it's not overloaded again. To do a parallel highlight, as the name may suggest, I want to keep the brush as parallel as possible to the surface I'm painting, using the edge of the brush to add the paint rather than the tip. By painting parallel with a surface, it means the brush physically can't get into the depths of a surface, so all those shades we just placed down will stay nice and dark. Usually, I'll pull the brush towards the center of the lightest area to lift it, and come at that line again from the other side, and take a little more time in the areas I can't get the perfect angle. Do that with every color, and I'll have a complete model ready for a game. It won't be winning me any high-level contests, it's a bit messy up close, and wouldn't stand up to the scrutiny. But for the most part, we'll be looking at it from this far away anyway, so it doesn't matter. Within a whole army just to play, there's zero wrong with this.
However, I want to touch on what I think the biggest problem with this technique is. And it has nothing to do with the technique at all, but how it impacts us as potential miniature artists. And that's stagnation. Every supply, auxiliary paint, triad, contrast is designed not to make us better artists, but just to make us more efficient at doing this, and just this. And if all you want to do is get things on the table, that's totally fine. But for me, at some point it wasn't about the tabletop anymore. I wanted to improve my art. So the question then becomes, is there ways to improve by building from this system? The first thing I want to talk about is contrast differences. When it comes to paint triads, you have a set in stone contrast, a dark, a medium, and a light. But just by varying the amounts of each one way or another, we can drastically change how those colors affect the model.
I'll start with dark and use the same pigments as the leathers in the first method I did. I'll actually be mixing some of the wash into the base brown that we started the base coat with. Leather isn't always a bright brown. Sometimes they can be quite dark in nature, depending on the style. So by starting from a darker starting point by mixing in some of our dark to get started, we bring everything down by that half level. So when we do our wash, it's already a darker shade, and the contrast between the shade and base isn't as intense. And we don't need that cleanup step since the wash was already part of the base. When it comes to the highlight, we can use the middle tone just straight and get those edges again. But now we can mix in some of the light of the triad, again reducing the contrast between the two colors, to do some spot highlighting, where we edge highlight the edges again, but only at the highest points. So without changing paints, we've changed the look of the leather to be a dark leather compared to the original, which results in a reduced contrast from light to dark, but not overall contrast since we still have all those steps in there. The same goes for the light side of things. When I did the bandages, I started with a light color, and I'll do the same here, but then the shade on its own took the light of the bandages all the way to a pretty deep dark in the recesses. So this time, when I go to wash, if I mix in a bit of the light base instead, we can keep those recesses a little lighter overall, again lowering the contrast, but making the final piece lighter overall. To get our edges, we can even use a pure white, and it won't stick out too much as it would with a darker start. So that's how we soften contrasts. But when would we want to actually multiply the contrast? The answer is when we want things to look shiny, which metallics we definitely do. So let's do that with the gold. Before it was just the gold, a wash, the gold again, and a lighter gold for the highlight. To get our dark part of the metallic darker, we don't need black, just a tiny bit more of our time. By giving the gold parts a second controlled wash in the areas we want to be darker, like undersides and deep recesses, we add even more pigment covering the base layer. So while the first wash filled in the gaps, this one fills in more of the general area, thus making it more darker and more contrast. And if you're really in the zone, a third wash will really push that contrast further. When it comes to the fix-up layer, we have to be a bit more controlled as well, staying away from the parts darkened with that second wash. To get our extreme contrast on the other side, we only have to introduce one thing, and that's a silver. Mixing it with the highlight gold, we can do what we did with the leather, and just pick out sharper edges to reinforce those really bright highlights. When it comes to the shade part of the equation, there's lots of possible ways to experiment. This one is kind of a precursor to wet blending and can be an easy way to ease into the idea of doing wet blending. I'm going to use some contrast for it just so it's a bit easier for you to see what's going on, but it's possible with thinner washes. I'll start by giving the part I'm about to wash a thin layer of medium or water, then add a dab of the wash or contrast to the tip of the brush. Starting in the recessed areas you want to be darker, as you pull the brush outwards, It thins the wash and creates a softer transition between where the wash is heavy versus thin. So the extremities will still get a wash, but it'll be more feathered, and it won't take much more time at all. Another thing you can do with your shade tone is to actually start with it. This is why you might use a black primer over a gray or white, because by starting dark, as you base coat, you can leave the shadowed corners alone. It'll take more precision, but if you're using nice opaque or similarly dark colors, it shouldn't be any more effort. By starting with a dark purple on the black part of the cloth here, then adding a bit of my highlight color for the fix-up step, by the time we get to the highlight, I haven't had to wait for anything to dry, and we get a nice dark cloth that should match with the red as well. The last shading idea I have is to do a bit of hue shifting. Hue shifting means to actually change colors instead of just making a color darker. So in the case of the red skirt on the rider, after it's been based the same way as the original step, instead of giving it a wash with the brown, which is pretty much just dark orange, which is why it works well for the red, we can give it a wash of dark blue, purple, or green, adding a bit of coolness to those shadows, which will really contrast with the red, but retain lots of the saturation so your model overall doesn't turn out too brown or black.
Since the 3-step system is actually 4 steps when you count the fix-up layer, there's a potential to scrap that for something a little more advanced, but not too much more time when paired with the highlight step.
What I'm talking about is glazing, and so I've started the bone on this beast's face with a bone color, then did my brown wash as normal. But instead of the fix-up layer, I'm going to jump right to the highlight, and not just edge highlights, but layer highlights, going around from spot to spot where the bones stick out the most and adding a bubble-like layering. Like the base coat, it's actually a good idea to do this twice too. Once that's done, I want to mix together my mid-tone and highlight again, and add about 50% water, thinner, or medium to it. The goal with this is going to be to bridge the gap between the shaded base coat and the highlights we just put down. We do that by drawing this thinned mix from the outside of the highlight to where they meet, lifting the brush, then doing the same thing again from the inside of the highlight, pulling it to where the two meet and lifting the brush. This will make sure that the midpoint is exactly between the highlight and shade and feather off either side into them. It's not much harder to do than a fix-up layer, but will give a much smoother transition than an edge highlight. It can be done a few times as well, letting it dry each time until you're happy with the feathering. And I believe if you can get the hang of even just one of these tiny changes to the system, you'll be well on your way to starting to develop your own style and system that will separate you out from the script. And by no means is this everything. There's all sorts of creative ways to use the paints we have, new types of paints, new styles to try, and people to learn from. And even if you have your own system exactly how you like it, every once in a while, try someone else's. It may end in failure, or it might not be for you, but it'll be another step taken in this painting journey.
Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.